What do you think of when you think of a Western?
I hadn't been a huge Western fan before this, but the more that I read and the more I researched, the more I found that there was a tradition of Westerns not always being just sort of, shoot 'em ups with guys. There's a richness there and a diversity and something that I could both kind of subvert, maybe what you might expect to get from a Western, but also be part of this larger tradition that's existed for a long time.
Anna North flips the white male trope of Westerns on its head by following a ragtag team of female outlaws in her new novel, Outlawed.
When I set out to tell this story, I did think it would be really interesting to, look at this idea that people have of the hole in the wall gang and sort of gender flip it, have it be women, have it be non-binary people, what if it wasn't, again, just cisgender men.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Are you joining us from Brooklyn?
Yep, I'm here in New York. It's about to snow, I think.
Lucky for you. You had a teasing of it this morning, not much.
Yeah.
So first I want to congratulate you because I feel like your new book, Outlawed, is on every list of what to read in 2021. How does that make you feel?
Thanks so much. Yeah, no, it's been really nice to see the support. I mean, I think especially it's been so nice because it's not quite out yet. I've seen some really nice things from booksellers and librarians, and that really warms my heart. It's especially such a weird hard time for bookstores that it's just really nice to hear from booksellers any way I can.
So when this recording actually comes out on January 7th, your book would have just been released. Can you kind of give us a synopsis of Outlawed for those of us who aren't lucky enough to have read it yet?
Sure. So, Outlawed is, I think of it as sort of a revisionist Western, and it's about it's an alternate history, a retelling of the story of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and the Hole in the Wall gang. But it focuses on the story of Ada, who is a young woman. She's apprenticing to be a midwife. But when she gets married and she's not able to become pregnant, she lives in a society that is very stigmatizing toward people who have infertility. They're even burned as witches. I should say this book takes place in an alternate version of around 1894, 1895. And so she has to flee, and she ends up taking up with the Hole in the Wall gang and going on a series of adventures to sort of determine both how she can be safe and also sort of finding her own calling in life.
Yeah, she goes on a lot of different journeys, which I'm excited to talk about. But Outlawed it's gender bending, it's genre bending, and I want to get to the gender aspect of it. But first, I want to talk about the genre. And like you said, it's a reimagined Wild West, if you will. Have you always been interested in Westerns? How did this idea come to play?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I originally came to this idea. I was visiting a Shaker museum in New Hampshire. So the Shakers were a sect. They were sort of a separatist religious sect. They lived apart from the rest of society, I believe, starting in the 17th century, moving forward. And they were celibate. They didn't marry. They didn't have children. And it was also a time in my life when, my husband and I were starting to talk about, should we have children? I have a son now. So I think this was on my mind. And I think just also these issues of fertility, infertility, reproduction. I think it's so for anyone who's, assigned female, I think this becomes this, big thing that society sort of puts on you that this is going to be an incredibly important part of your life, an incredibly important part of how you're read by everyone, whether or not you have a child. So I was just so interested in this group of people where they took themselves out of that. They're like, we're not going to do this. We're going to live this very separate life. And I started writing about kind of separatists, people who were living outside of society, people who didn't have children or who couldn't have children. And I was setting it in these sort of, northeastern woodland settings, like where I had visited this place and had this idea. And it kind of wasn't working and it wasn't taking. And I was like, why isn't this any good? Probably I spent a year just writing stuff, throwing it away. But I just had this problem where the richness of the setting wasn't coming through when I tried to set it in the Northeast. And that's when I really started thinking about Westerns. I think in part because of this idea of like people living in the wilderness, people who are living separately. And I was like, oh, well, outlaws, in like a traditional Western story, they would live in like a hideout, they would live separately from society and have different rules. And then the more and more I researched Westerns, I hadn't like been a huge Western fan before this, but the more that I read and the more I researched, like the more I found that there was a tradition of Westerns not always being just sort of, shoot 'em ups with guys. There's a richness there and a diversity and something that I could both kind of subvert, like maybe what you might expect to get from a Western, but also like be part of this larger tradition that's existed for a long time.
As a journalist, you've written for Vox and numerous other outlets, so you're used to researching, but how is the research process in writing Outlawed? I know you visited the hole in the wall. Kind of describe to me that journey.
Yeah, this is my third book and it's the one that I've done the most research for by far. I've always been like kind of afraid of research for novels, which is weird because in my journalism obviously I have to do it a lot, but I think like when I'm working on fiction, it's like, well, if I'm not actually writing, then I'm not working. I'm not getting my work done. Um, but for this, I really felt like I had to, especially writing an alternate history. Like this isn't set in our world, so I didn't feel like everything had to be the same, but I felt like I at least wanted it to kind of have verisimilitude and feel like it could happen. So that was a big part of it. Just reading history books, making sure that, I wasn't just learning about the history, of folks like the Hole in the Wall Gang, but also history of Black Americans in the American West. I read some Native American history, and I should say also like there are Black outlaws, Native American outlaws. These are like not that outlaw is like a technical term, but like even those kind of stories you're familiar with, like those, weren't just white dudes either. They're women. Also there's women in the Hole in the Wall Gang in real life. So like the West was sort of never just like Dirty Harry is one thing that I learned like really clearly. But also, so in addition to like that history and that reading, just going there was really important to kind of get what I was saying before, the sort of like richness of the setting. I'd been to Wyoming before. I'd been, around the West as a kid, but I really wanted to see like what does the hole in the wall actually look like, spend some time there, take a bunch of photos. Was lucky enough to be able to spend like a week in the area just really sort of soaking up what does it look like, what does it smell like. I was just going back through my videos. I realized I took video just of the sound to remember like what do the bugs sound like. Loud is the answer in the summer. um, and I'm a bird watcher, so I like took a lot of notes on what kind of birds I saw, what kind of animals I saw, and a lot of that made it into the book too. So just kind of like being able to have a good enough sense of the setting in my mind that I could actually like go back there.
The imagery was perfect because I read Outlawed and then I actually was doing some research on Hole in the Wall and I was like, that makes complete sense. I can imagine out in all these scenarios. So you did a very fantastic job. It was great to read. I also want to know, since you do have a journalism background, and you've written about reproductive rights and health and all of the politics that come with that, especially nowadays. How did that influence your writing of Outlawed?
I think for a long time, I really thought of my journalism and my fiction as very separate spheres, and they still are to a degree. Like it's a very different headspace, and I kind of try not to like, be wearing my fiction hat when I'm doing my journalism and things like that. But I have like throughout my career focused a lot on reproductive health, reproductive justice, and like the politics of those things, and definitely that had a big impact on this book. And then this book has also had an impact on that because for the book I had to research a lot about midwifery and sort of the history of midwives. And that turns out to be super important for politics and health today because actually for a long time, for generations, midwives really controlled reproductive health in the US, and male doctors weren't involved that much. And when you see male doctors kind of come into the field, that's actually when you see more restrictions coming into place, so restrictions on abortion, things like that. Whereas when midwives would tend to provide like the full spectrum of reproductive health, whether it's delivering a baby, whether it's terminating a pregnancy, and non-reproductive health, like they would just do a lot of ordinary healthcare for people. Um, and so not only do you sort of see like male doctors kind of introducing more restrictions, but there's also evidence now, for example, that like in maternal health that being cared for by a midwife can be really beneficial. And in the UK, for example, a lot of people get midwife care. It's not as common here in the US, and there's some suggestion that that actually contributes to our maternal mortality. So just the way that like midwives kind of got forced out of the delivery room and out of healthcare generally is really fascinating and kind of disturbing. And that definitely, I knew a little bit about that before writing the book. And certainly, like I remember that it just like the idea that Ada's mother would be a midwife just kind of like felt like it came to me out of nowhere. And certainly like, that probably had to do with like how much work I'd already done around reproductive health in my journalism job. But especially now I feel like partly because of the book, partly also just because the time we're in, I've just learned a lot more about this history. I mean, I mentioned the time because especially at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot more people were interested in home birth. People were concerned about giving birth in a hospital. And so I think there's been this like resurgence of midwifery and like a resurgence of attention to it. It's a really interesting time, I think, and I'm sort of excited to see like, how that continues to develop.
A lot of the reviews to Outlawed have been described as it's this dystopian novel, and you touched on it a bit by saying it's an alternate history, right? And I agree with that. It's less dystopian and more of like that could have really happened, and it kind of almost did, and it might in the future with these underpinnings of medical malpractice whenever it comes to women and people of color. And you touched on systemic racism and some mental health issues in Outlawed. So, can you kind of tell me how you view Outlawed?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. I don't exactly think of it as a dystopia. I mean, it definitely, like certainly there are things about the world that Ada lives in that are really bad, but there's also a lot of things about the world that we live in right now that are really bad. I think as I get older, as sometimes like the world looks like more actually dystopian, I'm less like I'm less like excited about the end of the world and more like, okay, what is it like when humans are forced to deal with really hard things and like what choices do they make and how do they kind of handle it? And that's really how I think about Outlawed. Like, like yeah, like it's Ada like faces a lot of danger that other characters face even more danger in some ways. But this is what they do and these are their adventures. And I did also want it to be fun. Like it's about a lot of serious stuff, but like, I've been telling people like there's a reason people like westerns. There's a reason people like sort of genre fiction. Like one of the reasons is that it's entertaining, and I wanted to kind of like bring some of that in too and not have it just be super heavy.
Yeah, yeah, it was really fun to read, but also heavy, which is like the perfect balance. So,
Thank you.
so I wanted to get to the gender aspect of Outlawed because the hole in the wall gang that you personified is this ragtag team of mostly female or non-binary, gender fluid group of people and people that I really want to be friends with. I kind of describe how important it was for you to kind of encapsulate all of these different genders and sexualities into the focal point in this book.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, when I set out to tell this story, I did think like, oh, it would be really interesting to, look at this idea that people have of the hole in the wall gang and sort of gender flip it, have it be women, have it be non-binary people, what if it wasn't, again, just like cisgender men. The more research I did, the more I learned like even the actual hole in the wall gang, there were women, at least one woman who was like fairly famous. So part of it was just like, well, let's represent like how things actually were in the American West and everywhere, where people have always been non-binary, people have always been trans, people have always like had a variety of gender expressions. And like the more I researched too, the more I found accounts of however someone might have identified at the time, people that might have identified as trans in the West in the 18th and 19th century. Just this idea that like I think there's a discourse that somehow, that being transgender or being non-binary or any of these things are somehow new or invented. And like the more that you look at history, the more clear it is that that's not true. So just wanting to explore that a little bit. But also again, I think, to some degree, like these themes around fertility, around reproduction, it like not always, but often it is folks who are assigned female at birth, whether whether they're female, whether they're actually female or identify as female or not. Often it's those folks who like feel that weight of like, in this book, like a deep stigma for being infertile, which also exists in our real life, or sometimes a stigma for being fertile, a stigma for having a child, a stigma for having the number of children that someone believes is not the appropriate number of children for you for whatever reason, whether it be racism, whether it be classism. I do think that like there are groups of people for whom those kinds of stereotypes fall heavier. And so I wanted to kind of look at that too. Um, yeah, and I just like wanted like to try, and I think there are going to be places where this book falls short. And I'm sort of excited to have it be in dialogue with other books, other sort of revisionist westerns, and there's been a number. I think I've been talking a lot about a book called How Much of These Hills Is Gold, which I just finished reading kind of recently, but is really wonderful and tells the story of the American West and the gold rush, and talks really poignantly about like the theft of land, both from Indigenous people, but then also from Chinese American immigrants. Just I don't know, just a really good story. But I guess like I wanted, in my book, I think I wanted to draw attention to the sort of like panoply of human experiences that comprised what we sometimes call the American West, but obviously like wasn't West or American to a lot of people who lived there. Just kind of call attention to that panoply. And now that I'm just out here as a person talking about the book, I can point to like there's lots of other books that call attention to that panoply, maybe like even better than mine.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I feel like our idea of like the Western frontier is just, it's a completely whitewashed idea, right? I mean, it wasn't a frontier to the indigenous people who lived there. That was their home. So that's an interesting point you brought up.
Yeah, I mean, I think like especially in my research, what I did really like, as a white writer myself, like found like it helpful in terms of questioning that idea of a frontier. I think, there is this idea of, the West as a place where people, like a very white idea of the West as a place where people could kind of strike out and you can, make it your own. And I think, there's a really interesting tension there because, for example, like in the Western states and territories back when they were territories, like there were freedoms for groups of people that didn't have those freedoms in the East. So, like, for example, white women could vote in a lot of parts of the West before they could vote necessarily in the East, which is super interesting, and other, kinds of economic freedoms for white women. There like weren't that many women in the West. So sometimes that could like get you stuff. Um, Although it's also like that's also problematic. But at the same time, right, that freedom comes at the price of all the people who were there before, and who mostly were having their freedoms taken away.
So let's talk about some of the characters. Obviously, I want to talk about Ada, the protagonist, if you will, in Outlawed, and she has numerous journeys along her way, and she learns a lot from all of the different places she visits. Kind of describe what it was like to write someone like Ada.
She was really fun to write. I think I struggled at first trying to figure out like what is going to be her motivation. I think I had sort of like when I was writing the story, I had an idea of like here's where I wanted to go, here's what I wanted to do. I had an idea of like what does her family look like and like what is her basic problem that, she gets married and she's supposed to have a baby and she doesn't have a baby. But I think like what kind of like cracked her open for me was when I realized like, oh, okay, she's someone that just cares. She really cares a lot about acquiring knowledge and understanding things. And like that's what really drives her. Like not just trying to flee, trying to get away, but also like she wants to learn like, well, why, how come I can't conceive? Like how come some people can't, some people can? What's the actual science behind this? And I think when I realized that like she's someone that asks those kinds of questions and that's what really drives her, like then I sort of felt like I understood her more and I was able to kind of like access her character through a lot of the scientific books that she reads, the research that she does, which, some of which was research that I had to do, some of which was research that I made up. Like some of the like theological texts, like from the sort of version of religion that they have, like I made some of those up. Those aren't real, but But like the basics of medicine, I tried to research those as clearly as I could. So yeah, I think for me, like understanding her was really like a process of understanding like what is she after, like what does she really want to get in addition to just like being safe.
Yeah, Ada was really interesting to me because her hunger for knowledge, and then also the fact that she learned so much and she grew so much as a person. I feel like she learned a lot of valuable lessons, and she was also open to learning. I feel like a lot of characters sometimes are just very unchanging, but it was really fun to watch Ada just kind of learn and to process and to move on, and it was great reading her story. And then also, I think one of my favorite characters might be Mama, and she just came across so steadfast and one of the most progressive characters in Outlawed. And she, as you mentioned, was a midwife, so she had that scientific background, but it was really hard for her to outwardly express her beliefs because it was such a religiously controlled society. Why was it so important to you and to include Mama as this character in Outlawed and someone Ada really looked up to and wanted to emulate?
Yeah, I mean, she's someone that really like, I felt like I had to like work at Ada's character a little bit, but Mama like really kind of like came to me whole cloth. Like I felt like as soon as I thought of the story, I thought of like, oh, okay, there's gonna be this character. She's a midwife. Like, these are her children. This is what she does. Really early on, the idea that she would have postpartum depression came to me, and like that becomes an important part of Ada's life because Ada needs to like step in and take care of her younger siblings. um I think with Mama, like another thing too is she kind of enabled me to show a little bit about this world. So, for example, like she's not married, and she actually has had multiple partners, but like nobody really bugs her about it because she has enough children. And the idea that like it's another way that I didn't want it to be necessarily just a flat out dystopia, like certainly like this is a very repressive society for women, but women who have a lot of children are actually able to gain, weirdly perhaps more freedoms than they would have had in real life 1894, 1895. And so kind of getting that across too, that like, there in every society there's ways to gain and lose status. And like I think Mama like has attained a lot of status in the society, and that enabled her to be free in certain ways other people weren't free, like including Ada, who doesn't have children and she has basically no freedom in the society.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. And then lastly, and I can go into all the characters, but we don't have all day. And then the kid was obviously very interesting to read and to discover and to acknowledge because the kid is just the kid, no pronouns, non-binary, and the kid also deals with some mental health issues that Ada really steps in and she has the knowledge to help the kid through these circumstances. Describe to me in your own words the kid.
Yeah, I mean, the kid is another person. Some parts of the kid like really came to me like, without like working too hard. And other parts like were kind of harder and I had to think more about it. And I think one thing that I wanted to do was think through like I wanted the kid to both embody like certain things about like what you think of as like a conventional outlaw, and also sort of subvert those and like be interesting and new. So like at the beginning, for example, like the sheriff is like talking about all the kids like scary exploits, and the kid is very like renowned, and so I wanted that to be there. But then I also wanted like the fact that the kid is a preacher, for example, maybe is not necessarily what you think of an outlaw. And also the kid like cares a lot about clothes, and his art is always like really beautifully dressed in this very specific way. um I wanted to have like a little bit of like a mythic figure, and also someone who's the leader but like pretty flawed. Like I think like I did really want to convey that like the gang like is totally held together by the kid, and like the kid is absolutely like the gravity that kind of binds them. um and at the same time, like maybe the kid's strength is not necessarily as a tactician, like the plan is like not exactly perfect. But I also didn't want like an anti-hero either. I think I just wanted to express like, you know, this is a flawed person like any other person, but the kid does have this ability to just like really captivate people. And that was evident like when the kid was growing up, in the town that their family lived in, and now in this totally different setting. So yeah, I mean, I think just trying to play with and subvert some of those outlaw tropes, and also to kind of like look at like, what is a leader? What does it mean to lead people? Like, what does it mean to lead them astray? What does it mean to lead them in the right direction? What does it mean to lead people who have been cast out? Some of these I feel like even by the end are just still sort of questions in my mind, but those are all the questions I was thinking about when I was writing the kid.
Based on that, there's still questions in all of our minds. Let's go to the ending. I don't want to talk details or specifics about the ending, but is this something that you envisioned the entire time, or did you kind of it just made sense at the time? Is that the ending that you envisioned?
Yeah, it is. I knew that from almost the very beginning. And yeah, without giving too much away, when I first like workshopped it with my writing group, I feel like some of them were mad at me and wanted a different ending. But yeah, I mean, that was always the idea, to the extent that I actually like when I did my research trip, I made sure to like go to some places that would be similar to the place that's described at the ending. Even though that was like, probably like 2 years before I finished the book. So yeah, that's one of the things that I always had in mind.
I love the ending, and I feel like it also might be open to an Outlaw too, or maybe I should just ask what's next for you.
That is a great a great question to ask at the end. I mean, I know this is going to air at another time, but at the end of 2020, it's a great question. I think it's been really interesting to even like think about writing fiction this year. So like I finished the copy edits on Outlawed like right when we were starting to lock down here in New York. And then I basically have not like had free time to do fiction most of the year because a lot of times we haven't had childcare. Again, pandemic. Um, but when I do just like even think about it, I'm also wondering like, you know, before all this started, I thought my next book would be set like in our world, like the real world. It would be a realist novel. My second novel, Sophie Stark, is set in the real world. My first novel is not. This novel is not. I had an idea for something that would be set in the real life Earth. But it's like really hard to write about the real world right now because I don't even know what does it look like. Do I set it in 2019 before all this happened? Does everyone social distance? Do people wear masks? Like, do I set it in the midst of the pandemic? Do I set it in 2025 within the aftermath? It's very hard. We're in such flux. It's very hard for me to figure out like what is the present, the current time. Where are we? What are we doing? That's definitely really affected like what kind of project I think I'm going to do next. But I'm sort of like just now at this point starting to get back to the idea that I was going to work on before lockdown and taking some notes. And I'm not going to say too much about it because I might throw it away again. But, for now, I'm working on this book that is set in real life Earth, and we'll see how that goes and how real life Earth goes, I guess.
I did read, speaking of what's next, is that so A24 bought Outlawed for a television series. What's going to be your role in that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not exactly sure what my role is going to be yet, but I'm definitely, hoping to at least be someone involved. And I'm actually really excited about that because I think, I mean, we talked about sort of like wanting to, in Outlawed, present like a number of different voices, diversity of voices. And again, like I'm one person, I'm a white person, I'm a woman. And so the idea of like having this world be, given over to like a larger group of people and a larger diversity of people who could speak to some of the experiences that I couldn't speak to as well, like that's really exciting to me. So I'm super excited to see what they do with it. I hope it, makes its way to the screen one day. I think that'd be really cool.
Anna Nora, thanks so much for being with us today. It was really a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me.